On the night of my wedding, I was kidnapped. The wealthy young master, who never believed in ghosts or gods, knelt at the door of the operating room. He prayed for his beloved to have a safe delivery. For over a week, the kidnapper made numerous calls to him, all left unanswered. When I was rescued, reporters asked me, "Miss Stella, what do you think of James kneeling and praying for you?" I just wished them both a lifetime of happiness and never parting. On my wedding night, I was kidnapped by James's rival. When I woke up, I was in an abandoned warehouse. A man with a scar on his face stood beside me, holding a knife to my throat. He said, "Miss Stella, as long as James is willing to exchange that piece of land in North City for you, I will let you go." The piece of land in North City was coveted by many. Due to a series of misunderstandings, it ended up in our hands. My family, in order to please James, gave it to him in exchange for some resources. To them, that piece of land had little value. But now, it could save my life. The kidnapper handed me a phone, saying, "Stella, I hope you can be sensible and not make it difficult for me." My hands trembled as I dialed a familiar number. No one answered. In that moment, my heart turned to ash. He suddenly smiled. "Stella, are you trying to fool me? Do you think I'm a 3-year-old child?" The kidnapper thought I was trying to stall for time. I dialed the wrong number, but those digits were etched in my memory. I tearfully pleaded, "I'm not lying, please give me more time." Repeated calls went unanswered, then went to voicemail. In that moment, I knew James didn't want to answer my calls. He always thought I was scheming, forcing myself to marry him. He never liked me, perhaps even despised me. The kidnapper restrained me and tied me up, using a bamboo stick to pick at my fingernails. From the age of 3, after my mother passed away, I was abandoned by everyone. My maternal family believed I was a jinx, blaming me for my mother's death, forbidding me from setting foot in their house. My stepmother didn't care for me, locking me in the basement, not knowing day from night. Sometimes, she even forgot to bring me food. At 18, they married me off to James as if I were a gift to their family. In this world, no one cared about me. Even if I died, perhaps no one would know. Maybe that was my fate. I was trapped here, unable to distinguish day from night. He hoisted me up, dunked me into a barrel, feeling myself suffocating. Then he whipped me, the pain so intense I couldn't catch my breath. He forced me to contact James. Despite my countless pleas, he never relented. But these days, no matter how many times I called James, his phone remained switched off. The kidnapper sent the photos of my torment to his email, yet he remained indifferent. Was I so insignificant to James? The kidnapper's disbelief echoed. I opened my eyes, chuckled softly, "Yes. Since that's the case, then please allow Stella to accompany me to my burial." I closed my eyes, waiting calmly for my fate. But before I felt the pain, I heard the sound of the door shattering. The kidnapper who held the knife to my neck was swiftly killed. He was dead. We never found out who was behind him. I wanted to find out, to have the police investigate further. James and my family took turns trying to dissuade me, advising me not to say a word. Because the wealthy families couldn't tolerate any gossip or scandal. Hearing their words, I chuckled softly, tears streaming down my cheeks. My heart felt like it was being squeezed, struggling to breathe. James's mother looked at me and whispered, "Stella, rest well. Mom will come see you tonight." Her voice was calm, gentle. If she hadn't told me to go out and find James, maybe I wouldn't have been kidnapped at all. They came in and out. At that moment, I saw James' figure on the television screen kneeling in front of the operating room, as if praying for someone. It was the day I was kidnapped. All I could hear now was a buzzing in my head. Everyone said James' first love was staying in this hospital. They had witnessed everything. Everyone discussed how James was devoted, willing to do anything for his first love. Even give his life, without blinking an eye. But as his wife, kidnapped and unable to reach him, I rode the elevator to the top floor. Emerging from the elevator, I saw James holding a child in his arms, whispering sweetly to the child as if it were a treasure. Until Nancy came up slowly. James softly said, why are you here? Is there anywhere that still hurts? They stood together, like a perfect couple. If this man wasn't my husband, I might have said they were well matched. I walked up to them, confronting them face to face. James caught sight of me, his brows furrowed as he handed the child to Nancy. Seizing my wrist and pulling me to a stairwell, I couldn't restrain the pain, tears cascading down my cheeks. He scolded me, "Stella, what are you causing a scene about now?" In that moment, my heart felt like it was being pricked by countless needles, aching intensely. After a moment, I found my voice. "James, why did you turn off your phone? You've been calling me endlessly, it's been so annoying." His tone was impatient, but to me, it felt like poison-laced dagger plunging into my heart. I lowered my eyes and let out a mocking chuckle. Until he saw my bandaged hand, he realized I was hurt. He looked straight at me and asked softly, "How did this happen?" I met his gaze and slowly said, "I was attacked by your enemies. They almost killed me by tearing off the nails of 10 fingers." He stood there, his eyes filled with shock, unable to say anything. But it didn't matter anymore. I said softly, "I'm passing by his side, one step at a time, going downstairs feeling like there are countless needles stabbing my feet. It hurts a lot." Tears blurred my eyes, almost causing me to fall down the stairs. James is no longer the same as in childhood. He will never be like when he was 12 and ran into me in the basement. He hugged me and said, "Stella, don't be afraid, I'll take you away." He wouldn't stand up for me when others bullied me, telling them, "Try touching Stella and see what happens." He was like a hero to me back then. But for him, I may have become a burden a long time ago. Perhaps I've even affected his normal life. I lowered my eyes, smiled and felt a sense of sarcasm spreading endlessly. In that instant, everything I worried about seemed to matter no more. Watching the figure walk into the room, I closed my eyes. He sat on the chair and asked me, "Does it hurt?" "James, I'm not in pain," I said, "let's get a divorce." At that moment, I felt incredibly calm. With no emotional fluctuations, James didn't say a word, offering me an apple instead. I opened my eyes to meet his dark gaze and said, "If you love Nancy so much, you shouldn't have married me." "Stella, I owe her, I can't just ignore her," I heard him say, which made me burst into laughter. Sarcasm filled my tone, and tears welled up in my eyes, sliding down the corners. At that moment, my heart felt numb. "James, please leave, I don't want to see you," I said. "Okay," he replied softly, placing the sliced apple on a plate. "Rest well, I'll come to see you later." It was only when I heard the door close that I finally let out a sigh of relief. For years, I had been warning myself not to follow my mother's path. Marrying James was not a good outcome, but the fact was, there was no other way for me. It was my only option. I had thought about running away, only to be caught and locked up, all my electronic devices taken away. I was released only on the day of the wedding. James had no choice but to marry me if he wanted to inherit his family's fortune. We were both puppets being manipulated. The day before the wedding, I was still thinking how much I liked James. As long as he treated me well, even if he didn't love me, we could have lived respectfully together. He would cook, I would tend the flowers, and maybe raise a child. He would have been a good father. But that was just a fantasy. When I went to the pharmacy to get medication, I ran into Nancy, who had just been discharged. James was holding a child and tenderly advising Nancy to be careful. The affection in his eyes was about to overflow, but during the few days I spent here, he was always serving Nancy, except for occasionally bringing me a meal. I lowered my gaze, laughed softly and thought to myself. I picked up the medication from the window, and as I passed by Nancy, she stopped abruptly, turned back and tentatively called out, "Stella." I paused, composed my emotions, turned to her and asked, "Yes?" Before I could say anything else, she was already in tears, looking pitiful, but I felt even more pitiful. My husband spent all his time by her side, ignoring me completely. Seeing her like that, I asked, "What's wrong?" "Nancy, I'll give you everything, including James, if that's what you want," I said, taking a few steps forward, locking eyes with her, and stubbornly waiting for her response. But before I could continue, tears streamed down her cheeks. She looked so miserable. But I felt even more miserable. My husband was always with her, never leaving her side, while I was invisible to him. Seeing her tears, I asked with a light smile, "What's the matter, Nancy? I'll give you everything, why are you still crying?" Suddenly, James grabbed my wrist, pulled me behind him, and angrily whispered, "That's enough, Stella," even though he knew I had injuries on my hand. Despite the crowd around us, I didn't want to become a laughingstock. I looked up at James and couldn't help but laugh foolishly. Then I glanced at the child he was holding and looked at Nancy, saying, "The child is adorable, but doesn't look like James. He treats you so well that anyone would think the child is yours." My voice was not low, and people around us started gossiping, making the crowd grow larger. I left the place of gossip and returned to the hospital room. The media caught wind of the incident and crowded around my room. The noise from the outside world echoed in my ears. James called someone to deal with the situation and tried to send them away. I opened the door, saying, "Come in." They filed in, and I looked down at my bandaged hand, smiled faintly, and said, "I won't bother to greet you." But then someone asked me, "Ms. Stella, what do you think about James kneeling to pray for Mike's wife to marry him? Wishing them a happy marriage?" Maybe I made a shocking statement, as the room fell silent. Everyone knew James and I had just gotten married, and Nancy had a husband as well. It was just an attempt to embarrass me. Then I added, "If they love each other so much, I wish them a long and happy life together, never to be separated." The day I was discharged, I returned to the new house. There were still joyful signs on the door and in the elevator, but I found it all utterly ridiculous. A pair of new people without love, even though many people bless them, still don't feel festive. I plan to divorce, but the people from my family and James's family take turns persuading me to just live with it. Divorce is not a good thing for both families. My father even threatened me that if my grandfather found out about this, there would be consequences. Luckily, James didn't come back for a while. Without having to deal with James, I enjoyed my freedom. I would make a cup of coffee in my spare time and sip it slowly. When I found something funny on TV, I would laugh out loud. Just then, I heard the sound of the door opening and saw James before I could even turn around. Before I could react, he had already entered the room and walked up to me. "Stella, I brought dessert for you." He placed the cake in front of me as if presenting a treasure. It was a chocolate cake, my favorite when I was young. When I lived in James's house, his grandfather would have the maid specially buy it for me. But this time, it tasted bitter, not sweet at all. I closed it and threw it into the trash. "I don't want it," I said as I turned around to go back to my room. But in an instant, I heard James's voice coming from behind me. "Stella, I promised my grandfather to marry you. I will treat you well." James packed up the cake box. "I won't go see Nancy anymore." He lowered his gaze, packed up his things, including the takeout I ordered, and threw them in the trash. He took out a few ingredients from the fridge and went into the kitchen. I hadn't seen him cook in years. When he was younger, he had to sneak downstairs at night to cook because the family didn't allow him to eat that fast food. One time, I happened to see it. Just as I was about to speak, he ran up and covered my mouth. "I'll share half with you when it's ready." I smiled at him and said, "Okay." He was only 18 at that time. He was extremely kind to me. Looking back, the feelings then were probably just familial. Our families were close, and I had stayed with James's family for a while. He had watched me grow up since I was little. There should have been no love between us. But by then, a seed had already been planted in my heart, slowly sprouting. I always thought about going to the same university as James, following him and being by his side. Unfortunately, reality always falls short. If you don't like it, you just don't. It can never be changed. But life had to go on. To please me, James came home on time at night. Breakfast was already prepared on the table in the morning. He even had a bunch of luxury goods sent to me. Seeing them being brought in, I couldn't help but find it funny. But we still treated each other with respect in front of others, pretending to be affectionate. In reality, we didn't speak a word at home, and we didn't sleep in the same room at night. But neither of us mentioned divorce again. On my birthday, James organized a birthday banquet for me. He accompanied me into the venue and put on a good show. Everyone admired me, saying how lucky I was. As I listened to the chatter below, I turned my head to look at James. As the clock struck 11, James's phone suddenly rang. I heard Nancy's voice on the other end, sounding tearful. "James, the child has a fever, and there's no one at home. I'm so scared." Every word was crystal clear in my ears. James looked at me, his eyes filled with hesitation. But that hesitation was like a sharp knife stabbing at me. I knew he wanted to go. I looked up at him. "James, you promised not to see Nancy again." He embraced me and whispered in a voice only we could hear, "Stella, I'll take them to the hospital and come back to cut the cake with you." At that moment, he didn't hesitate for a second. Asking the maid to help him with his coat, he put it on and left without any hesitation, leaving me once again. I grabbed his sleeve and looked up at him. "James, that's not your child." He looked down at me, and I stared into his eyes, but I could tell he was avoiding my gaze. He said, "Stella, don't be unreasonable." Hearing that, I smiled and lowered my head. I let go of his sleeve and said softly, "James, if you go today, we will get a divorce." I took a step back. I thought I could scare him, but he left without a second thought. At that moment, I became the laughingstock of the room. It was supposed to be my birthday banquet. But my husband left me once again for someone else. James didn't come back to cut the cake. People were all gossiping around me. They said it was just a show. Some said that James never loved me, and marrying me was just because of James's grandfather. They weren't wrong. I went to get my clothes from the hall and was about to leave the house. Grandfather was sitting in a wheelchair, looking up at me, saying, "Stella, you must come to see me often in the future." "All right, I will," I promised as I left James's house. As I walked out, it started to rain. The rain fell on me, but I didn't feel any cold. I walked forward step by step, feeling a piercing pain in my heart. I endured the pain, walked 10 kilometers, and then walked back. My feet blistered, painful but not deadly. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Because the day before, James said he would cook noodles for me. But by morning, he still hadn't come back. At that moment, the tiny hope in my heart was completely shattered. I washed my face in the bathroom to wake myself up a little. Then, I packed my luggage in the bedroom. My marriage with James ended there. When I was leaving, I bumped into James on his way back. He stared at me blankly, his eyes full of curiosity. I just glanced at him, trying to pass by his side. But he grabbed my suitcase. "Where are you going?" "James, let's get a divorce," I said softly. "Stella, when we got married." Before he could finish his sentence, I interrupted. "James, I'll say it again. If you don't love me, you shouldn't have married me. Actually, I didn't marry you willingly either, but I couldn't resist. Our marriage is a shackle for both of us." I pushed away his hand and pressed the elevator button. As I stepped into the elevator, he stared at me intently, his eyes turning red with emotions about to overflow. It looked ridiculous. It wasn't until I got in the taxi that I realized I, who was born and raised in this city, never had a place to call home. So I found a hotel nearby and settled down. During these days, I hired a lawyer to draft a divorce agreement and send it to James. James messaged me, "Stella, stop messing around. We can't get a divorce. I promise you, I won't see Nancy again in the future." But I didn't believe him. His promises were worthless. He didn't come to find me, so I went to find him. When I went to the company to find James, the secretary told me he had gone to the meeting hall. He was commanding the setup of the venue, efficiently handling his subordinates. I had never seen him like this before. But even in this state, he had never belonged to me. Through the crowd, we gazed at each other from a distance. When he saw me, his face lit up with joy as he walked towards me from afar. He was the same as the James from before, yet everything about him seemed different. "Stella, come to the conference room." I followed him closely as he closed the door. Softly, I said, "James, I'm here to give you the divorce agreement." I took it out of my bag and handed it to him. Seeing there was no pen on his desk, I rummaged in my bag and pulled out a pen to give him. When he caught sight of the pen, his pupils constricted, and he tremblingly took it from my hand. Looking into my eyes, he asked, "Stella, do we have to do it this way?" Seeing him like that, I chuckled and said, "James, I'm not garbage, and neither are my feelings." The first money I earned from a part-time job, I bought him a pen. He gave it to Nancy because she liked it. And she threw that pen in the trash. Coincidentally, I saw it near the trash bin when I was throwing garbage out and picked it up. Since we got engaged when I turned 18, he had never really looked at me. He poured all his dissatisfaction on me. "Stella, how could I?" His words were cut off as I interjected, "But you have to admit, you don't care about me, because even answering my calls annoys you." I stared at him, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't know who you love, but I know you don't love me. You just don't want to leave me. It's just that you can't explain it to your family." But seeing how determined I was, he opened the divorce agreement and signed his name at the designated place. Unfortunately, James' handwriting was a bit crooked. As I looked up at him again, his eyes were slightly red. It seemed like he was reluctant. Seeing him like that, I couldn't help but chuckle. I put the agreement back in my bag and looked at him. "On the day of the divorce, come to the hotel to pick me up." "Okay," he replied. When James came to pick me up that day, there was a commotion. There were many reporters outside the hotel, eager to get the first-hand scoop. After all, everyone wanted to see the scandal of a prominent family. I went directly to the underground parking lot in the elevator and got into James' car. On the way, he asked me again, "Is this marriage really irreparable?" "Yes, it is." "Irreparable," I responded. He fell silent but let out a sigh. It seemed like he was regretful about this marriage. That day, just like the day I saved him, snow began falling gracefully from the sky. I used to find the snow in the northern city insignificant, but today's snowfall was quite impressive. Yet he never believed it was me who wrapped him in the cotton jacket. He didn't believe I saved him. After graduating from high school, we decided to have our graduation party on a mountain in the suburbs. My stepmother didn't send a car to pick me up that night. A classmate gave me a ride down the mountain, and when I wanted to take a taxi alone, I found the road was closed and had to walk down. A car drove by extremely fast, passing right in front of me. Before I could figure out why a car was able to enter a closed road, I saw a bloody figure lying in the snow, blood oozing slowly from underneath him. The car had already hit him and fled. It was only after I saw him clearly that I realized it was James. I took off my cotton jacket and covered him with it, then called for an ambulance. The ambulance had to take a detour to get in. Even as I shouted James' name repeatedly. He was barely breathing, on the verge of passing out. Tears streamed down my face as I told him, "James, don't be afraid, I'll go stop a car on the road for help. Can you hold on for me?" But by the time I returned, James had disappeared in the snow. I was wearing light clothing and couldn't find him despite searching for a long time. Until I saw a classmate, Lucas, from a distance. He reached out and pulled me up, asking, "Stella, did you dress too lightly? Are you cold?" I was anxiously spinning in place, teary-eyed, and looked at Lucas. "Did you see James?" He was just there. Seeing him standing still, I grabbed his arm. "Can you help me find him?" He went home, Stella. Instead of taking me home, Lucas brought me to his rented house. I had a high fever, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake up. In my dreams, I saw myself and James. For many days, I could only hear voices but couldn't open my eyes. Later, I found out that someone had saved James. But when I asked many times, they all said it was Nancy. I tried to explain to everyone that it was me. But everyone thought I was joking. Only the heavens, the earth, and I know the truth. No one else believes me. Even though I told James countless times, he just said, "Stella, stop messing around. The divorce papers are signed and our marriage is over." I looked at James, about to say something, when I saw a familiar figure. It was Lucas. He walked past me and punched James in the face. James, that year Stella almost froze to death on the road trying to save you. Lucas's voice cut through like a sharp blade, piercing my heart and making it hard to breathe. James looked at me and then at Lucas. Shaking his head, he said, "It's impossible." The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was Nancy. It was Stella who called the ambulance, and she wrapped her own coat around you. She had a fever and was sick for several days. I lowered my gaze, but James walked up to me. He asked me, "Is what he said true or false?" I smiled and said, "James, just believe in yourself." Lucas stepped forward, as if he was about to do something. I stood in front of him and said to James, "If you and Nancy are together in the future, I wish you both a lifetime of happiness." James stood still, and I pulled Lucas's sleeve. I got into the car first, sitting in the passenger seat. I watched James get further and further away until his figure disappeared completely from my sight. Tears uncontrollably streamed down my face. In that moment, my hand felt so painful, really painful. Lucas turned his head to me and asked softly, "Is it hurting?" "Lucas, my hand hurts so much, really hurts," I said. Lucas stopped the car at the side of the road and hugged me. He just waited for my emotions to calm down, without saying a word. In those days, my tense emotions suddenly relaxed. The defenses in my heart collapsed all at once. Lucas leaned on my shoulder and said softly, "Stella, don't be afraid, I'm here." Just like that snowy night, his voice was like a sedative, calming me completely. The phone in my bag buzzed, and Lucas took it from my side and handed it to me. On the other end was my father's irritable voice, "Stella, hurry back to me now, or don't blame me for sending someone to bring you back." I knew the news had spread like wildfire. My family knew too. We rode in silence. He dropped me off at home. At the door, he stubbornly refused to unlock it, looking worried. "Don't worry, nothing will happen," I said softly. He lowered his gaze and looked out the window, saying quietly, "I'll be waiting outside for you. If anything happens, remember to call me." "Okay," I replied. I smiled at him, grabbed my bag, and got out of the car. As I pushed open the door, I saw many people I hadn't seen in years. There were my maternal grandfather's family and my paternal grandfather's family. Now, they were all gathered together because of my wedding, which was ironic. "Stella, kneel down," my grandfather's voice echoed as soon as I entered. Everyone's eyes turned to me. My stepmother and my so-called stepsister were there, watching the drama unfold. I looked up at my grandfather and asked, "Why should I kneel? You privately called off the engagement, betraying the family. Do you think you should kneel? Have any of you ever cared about me? I was taken away, but you were too embarrassed to bring me back. My mother died in the bathroom because of his affair. What did you say at the time?" The room fell silent. No one responded to my words. I lowered my gaze and continued, "You said it was her fate, that she was injured and couldn't bear a son, which is why my father had an affair. Even you, grandfather, said that in a family like ours, you have to turn a blind eye to survive." Memories flooded back. That year, my mother cut her wrist, staining the bathtub water crimson. She dyed her white t-shirt crimson. At 3 years old, I didn't understand why. I just wanted to find something to stop her bleeding quickly, but I couldn't do anything as I watched her life slip away bit by bit. I cried running downstairs, but found no one to help. Later, I found out that the house staff were all on leave. My father didn't want to come back because my mother was too controlling. In her final moments, she grabbed my hand and said, "Stella, when you grow up, you must leave this house." When I grew up, I ran away so many times, only to be brought back each time. Everyone told me that in a family like ours, we couldn't choose freely. Marriage or work, everything was arranged by the family. We had to accept our fate. I looked around and said word by word, "All of you are murderers. You all bear responsibility for my mother's death." Before I could finish my sentence, my father kicked me in the leg pit, causing me to kneel on the ground. I was held down, and no matter how I struggled, I couldn't get up. The whip struck me again and again, the pain spreading bit by bit. Laughter overflowed, full of mockery. My stepsister had a faint smile on her face, looking like I deserved it. I looked at her and said, "Amy, what happens to me today will happen to you tomorrow. You're laughing at me, but you're also laughing at yourself. In families like ours, everyone is a sacrificial lamb for interests, always has been." The voice echoed in the hall. In that moment, I saw Lucas. He stood in front of me, took off his coat and wrapped me up. I put my hand on his wrist and slowly stood up. I said to the people around, "Grandfather, the loss of the group is not because of me, and has nothing to do with me. So from now on, I don't want any relationship with this family. In these years, the group has lost most of it in my father's hands. So they wanted to use me to please James, so they could get some resources for our family. But on one hand they used me, on the other hand, they said I was an outsider. When I walked out, someone blocked me. Lucas picked me up, looked around and said, "Grandfather, don't make things ugly." I just saw my grandfather raised his hand and let them release me. The moment I stepped out of the house, I breathed a sigh of relief. No longer needing to rely on anyone, Lucas, who was once my benefactor, took me to his apartment to treat my wounds. Now he is a rising star in the northern city, sought after by everyone. I rested in the living room, asking me for anything if needed. As I watched his figure walk away, I closed my eyes. In that moment, everything became clear. My mother had not left me with nothing. She left me a charity organization that brought the benefactor Lucas into my life. She asked him to stay with me until I turned 18. Then send him abroad to study. When I turned 18 and got engaged to James, Lucas went abroad. I walked outside in my slippers and looked down at Lucas. "How long have you been back?" "Last year." He looked up and asked, "Are you going to ask me how I found out about your divorce?" I nodded by chance. He stood up to get me a glass of water from the kitchen and handed it to me, saying softly, "I'm sorry I came back late." I shook my head. "It's not your fault, it's my fate." Lucas was still the same as he was a few years ago, not talkative. During the days at his house, he took care of me. Besides working, he found some classic movies for me to watch. We each did our own thing. He didn't ask anything and I didn't say anything. After my wounds healed, I found a house outside and prepared to move out. As I left, I saw James. He was waiting for me downstairs from Lucas's place, and when he saw me coming down, he greeted me from afar. "I'll help you." "Not necessary," I replied. Lucas glanced at him, took my suitcase, and whispered in my ear, "I'll wait for you in the car." I pushed James' hand away, intending to pass by him. But I heard him say, "Stella, I don't know what's going on in your family." I stopped in my tracks at the sound behind me, turned to look at him, and whispered, "Even if you knew, what difference would it make?" "Take you away," he replied instinctively, but when I heard that, I couldn't help but laugh softly. I asked back, "James, can you really differentiate between love and gratitude?" He kept saying he owed Nancy, that's why he was so good to her. But deep down he was full of resentment. He had imagined a future with her, but I got in the way since I was forced upon him by his family, which naturally left him feeling uncomfortable. Yet, it was Nancy who saved him, that made him fall in love with her. So, in the end, he loved himself, not her. I looked up into his eyes, whispering, "James, you better first figure out what love and gratitude mean." Before he could respond, I walked ahead on my own. But he grabbed my wrist, and between the two of us, I turned to look at him. Seeing his eyes reddened, he lowered his gaze and chuckled softly, saying, "We have nothing, I liked you, but it was just that, a liking." I pushed his hand away, got into the car and watched his shadow disappear in the rearview mirror. Lucas gave me a glance, a smile deepening in his eyes. I asked him, "What are you laughing at?" He said, "Stella, don't look back. The past is a dead end, but the future lies ahead. Without the constraints of family, things will only get better." After cutting ties with my family, James sent me some money, which I accepted. It was money I deserved, considering all I had been through with him in the past year. There was no reward but hard work. James started investigating the incident where he was hit by a car and I was bound. The investigation pointed towards Nancy. It was Nancy who sent men to hit James and then had Nancy go save him. With no evidence, James's family tried to sweep the matter under the rug to prevent a scandal. That's why Nancy had acted so recklessly. Back then, James' father gave Nancy some resources in gratitude. But he vehemently opposed any marriage between James and Nancy. Nancy, feeling cornered, found someone else and married Mike, a man disabled since childhood, with a bad temper, often breaking things and resorting to violence against Nancy. Because Nancy had saved him, James was very kind to her. He helped her with the divorce and was by her side during childbirth. It was because Nancy wanted a piece of land that she sent someone to tie me up. Nancy even wanted to kill me because she always saw me as a barrier between her and James. When James found out about all this, he stopped helping Nancy and even pressured her. In the end, the head of Nancy's family ended up in jail, and their group went bankrupt. Seeing Lucas browsing through all this gossip, I chuckled softly. Closing the book in my hands, I pointed to the files on his desk. Lucas, why are you suddenly so interested in reading gossip? Stella, if James asked you to come back, would you? Before he could finish, I laughed and interrupted him. James wouldn't ask me to come back. He never forces anyone. He hugged me, resting his chin on my head, and whispered, let's get married. Before I could refuse, he said, I'll take you away from the northern city. For the past 2 years, Lucas has been helping me with some personal issues. We also tried to be in a relationship, but I never thought about marriage. It wasn't worth it for him to give up so much of his career to be with me. Lucas, I don't want what you've given up for me to create a barrier between us. I got up from his embrace, looked down at him and said, actually, this is fine as it is. Lucas got up and hugged me, lost in his own thoughts. That year, I went to visit James' grandpa. James' father told me that grandpa was waiting for me in the study. As I entered, he asked James to leave. I sat across from him, and he said, Stella, I'm sorry for how things turned out. No, it's my fault, I replied softly, hanging my head. I couldn't break free from my family, which led to this outcome. But Grandpa, I'll never forget the kindness you've shown me. When James carried me out of the basement years ago, it brought me here. Grandpa said to me, Stella, this house is your home. Stay as long as you want. I stayed for a year until my family came to take me back. If it weren't for Grandpa's support, I don't know how much suffering I would have endured. As I was leaving, I saw James standing at the door. He looked at me intently and started to speak, Stella, if you ever. Before he could finish his sentence, I cut in, James, I hold a grudge against you, and I will never forgive you. I hope to never see you again in my lifetime. Seeing me dressed lightly, Lucas approached and pulled me into his arms. That year, we watched fireworks and left the northern city. He said, I have no regrets. Later, we traveled to many places and saw countless worlds. In a place where no one knew us, we opened a small bar. We kept moving forward, never looking back. The experiences of those years are all in the past. Stella is just one of the many beings in this world. Year after year, Lucas and I watched fireworks on the mountain. That moment felt like a lifetime. Every year, we continued in this way.